She wasn't supposed to be out here alone. For 3 straight days, Mara Whitaker's 38 goats had walked to the exact same spot on the hillside and refused to take another step. They weren't grazing. They weren't spooked. They simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, ears forward, staring into a wall of kudzu, like something on the other side of it had told them to hold their ground. Mara had bought 55 acres of this land for $21 at a county tax sale. Vines so thick they'd swallowed fences, trees, even the shape of the hillside itself, until nobody left in the county could say for certain what had originally been out here. The land had sat abandoned for almost 60 years. Everyone told her the same thing before she signed the paperwork. It wasn't farmland anymore. It was just green. On the 4th morning, done waiting on an explanation from 38 goats who clearly weren't going to give her one, Mara gripped her machete and started cutting. One curtain of vine came down. Then another. She swung once more and stopped. Beneath her boots, the ground had gone hollow. Not soft. Hollow, the specific give of standing on something that wasn't hillside at all. What she found on the other side of that last wall of green would explain why 55 acres nobody wanted for 6 decades had been sitting on top of a fortune nobody knew was still there, and why the family that built it had once walked away from all of it and never come back. As you watch, see if you can figure out what the goats noticed before she did. Because the ground she was standing on wasn't the only thing about to give way. Mara backed away first, slow, the way you back away from thin ice once you understand it's ice. She tapped the toe of her boot against the ground a foot to her left. Solid. Then back at the spot where she'd been standing. Hollow, unmistakably, a sound like a drum instead of dirt. It took her the better part of an hour, working the machete carefully instead of swinging it, to understand what she was actually looking at. The vines hadn't just grown over a hillside. They'd grown over a roof, a low, sloped roof built directly into the slope of the hill itself. The kind of bank cabin old Appalachian homesteaders used to build so that one wall of the structure was earth and stone instead of timber, cool in summer, easy to heat in winter. From a distance, buried under 60 years of kudzu, the roofline had simply become part of the hill. She hadn't been standing on solid ground at all. She'd been standing on a roof over what would turn out to be a 12-foot drop into a stone-walled room below. Her goats had known. Whatever it was in a goat's instinct that reads weight and give and hollow ground better than any human foot ever could, all 38 of them had understood, 3 days running, that the hillside in front of them wasn't hillside. Mara sat down hard in the cleared dirt, hands shaking slightly, and understood that if she'd been walking instead of cutting, if she'd come at this from 10 feet to the left without a machete clearing the way first, she might have gone straight through. She didn't clear any further that day. She went home, poured a drink she didn't normally allow herself on a Tuesday, and sat at her kitchen table with a cedar chest she'd inherited from her grandmother years earlier, running her thumb over a carved pattern on the lid that nobody in her family had ever been able to explain. A rose vine, twisting in a specific, deliberate pattern, cut deep enough into the wood that it had survived 3 generations of moves and 1 house fire. She had no reason yet to connect it to anything. She just liked looking at it when she needed to think. Mara was 48, divorced 2 years, and had spent most of her adult life working around livestock without ever owning enough land to build anything of her own. When the county tax sale listing came up, 55 acres, decades of unpaid taxes, no heir ever bothering to claim it. She hadn't gone looking for a mystery. She'd gone looking for the cheapest possible fresh start, and $21 was about as cheap as fresh starts got. Everyone at the courthouse that day told her the same thing. More or less. That ground's not farmland anymore, honey. It's just kudzu now. One older clerk had laughed outright, not unkindly, filing her paperwork with the specific amusement of a woman who'd seen plenty of dreamers overpay for worthless dirt, but never one dumb enough to actually get it for $21. Mara didn't mind the laughing. She'd priced out heavy equipment and herbicide treatment for land that size, and found both entirely outside what she could afford, which was how she'd ended up, 3 weeks later, unloading 38 Kiko goats from a rented trailer. A hardy breed known for eating brush most cattle wouldn't touch, blackberry and privet, and kudzu included. The clearing itself was slow, unglamorous work. Mara followed behind the herd most days with hand tools, cutting back what the goats had loosened, hauling brush to a burn pile at the property's edge. The Georgia summer heat sat on the hillside like something physical, thick enough by midday that she'd taken to starting work before dawn just to get a few productive hours in before the air itself became an obstacle. Kudzu vine, cut fresh, smelled faintly sweet and green, almost pleasant, until you'd been breathing it in for 10 hours straight, and it started to feel like the smell of the work itself rather than the plant. Her hands blistered inside 2 weeks, then calloused over into something tougher, the particular toughening that comes from a body adjusting to a task it didn't ask for, but has decided to accept anyway. There was a bad stretch in the second month, a week of steady rain that turned the cleared sections to standing mud and cost her 2 days entirely when one of the goats, a young doe she'd named Clementine, went down with bloat after getting into a patch of wild clover she shouldn't have reached. Mara walked her for hours in the rain, drenched through, more frightened than she wanted to admit for an animal she'd owned less than 2 months, until the swelling finally eased and Clementine stood on her own again sometime past midnight. She sat on the porch steps of her rented trailer afterward, soaked and exhausted, and allowed herself, for the first time since signing the deed, a real moment of doubt about whether she'd taken on more than one woman alone could actually manage. She kept going anyway. But little by little, acre by acre, green gave way to something that looked, for the first time in decades, like land instead of jungle. It was on one of those slow, ordinary mornings that the goats first stopped at that particular stretch of hillside, and kept stopping there, 3 days running, until Mara finally understood they weren't going to move on without her. The tin box came 2 days after the cabin's roofline was fully exposed, once Mara had cleared enough of the collapsed section to climb carefully down into the room below. The structure inside had survived remarkably well for something buried under 6 decades of vine. Thick stone walls on 3 sides, hand-hewn timber framing the 4th, a rusted iron stove still standing near the back corner, children's height marks carved faintly into one wall at heights that stopped, abruptly, sometime around what looked like age 9 or 10. The box was under a loose floorboard near the stove, exactly the kind of hiding place a person chooses when they mean for something to be found later rather than never. Inside, a handwritten journal, its cover soft with age, a small stack of photographs, faces gone sepia and unfamiliar, a hand-drawn map of the property, more detailed than anything the county records held, old tax receipts, and a folded letter that had never been sealed into an envelope. Mara went through the photographs first, before the journal, spreading them carefully across her knees in the lantern light. Most showed the property itself, unrecognizable in its cleared, working state. A garden in full rows, the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, a much younger version of the fruit trees Mara had found half dead under decades of vine. One photograph, near the bottom of the small stack, showed 2 people standing on the same porch Mara now sat inside of, decades before it existed as a porch again. A lean, weathered man with his hand resting on a woman's shoulder, both of them squinting slightly into whatever light the camera had caught them in, neither smiling in the stiff, formal way people often didn't in old photographs, though something in their posture read as comfortable rather than posed. She turned it over. Written on the back, in the same hand as the journal, Elias and Ruth, home place, spring 1958. She set that one aside from the others, and it was the photograph she kept coming back to over the following weeks. Long before she understood, she was looking at her own great-great-grandparents rather than strangers who'd simply once lived where she now stood. Mara read the journal first, by lantern light, sitting on an overturned bucket in a room that had waited 60 years for someone to sit in it again. It belonged to a man named Elias Bell, and to his wife, Ruth. They'd worked this land for decades, goats, chickens, a kitchen garden, fruit trees, and built the whole property, as Mara slowly pieced together from years of entries, around water. A spring came off the hillside above the cabin, and Elias had spent years channeling it by hand through stone-lined troughs that still, in places, ran beneath the vine Mara had already cleared. One early entry stopped her longer than the others, dated some 40 years before the cabin had ever gone quiet. Ruth says I spend more hours on that spring than I do on her, and she's not wrong, but a wife can be fed from the table, and a family can't be fed from a dry well. Told her so. She threw a dish towel at my head and laughed, so I expect I'm forgiven. Cleared another 20 feet of the lower channel today. Hands are done for the week. Mara found herself smiling at that, alone in a stone room by lantern light, The way you smile at people you've never met, but somehow already like. Further in, the tone shifted, the handwriting tightening the way handwriting does under strain. Ruth poorly again this week. Doctor from town says rest. But there's no resting on 55 acres with nobody but the two of us to run it. I do what I can and pray the garden forgives what I can't get to. But one phrase recurred throughout the journal without ever being fully explained. The lower place. Elias wrote about protecting it, checking it, worrying over it during dry years, never once saying plainly what it actually was. She started looking for it the following week, guided by Elias's hand-drawn map, and, more reliably, by the goats themselves, who had developed an odd habit of drifting toward one particular uncleared corner of the property, whenever Mara let them work unsupervised. She'd assumed at first it was just good forage down that way. She was beginning to suspect otherwise. Clearing that section revealed the old stone channel Elias had built, still structurally sound in places, water finding its way through parts of it again almost as soon as the vine came off. And following that channel uphill, Mara found something that had nothing to do with the spring at all. Stone terraces. Long, deliberate rows cut into the hillside, running downslope in a pattern too regular to be accidental. The Bells hadn't simply farmed this land. They'd engineered it, built an entire system for managing water and preventing erosion across 55 acres, using nothing but hand tools and generations of hard-won knowledge about how hillsides actually behaved in heavy rain. Further down, half swallowed by vine that had clearly been fighting a losing battle against something planted deliberately decades earlier, Mara found fruit trees. Apple, pear, a scattering of muscadine vines gone wild along an old fence line. Most were dead or dying. A few, against every reasonable expectation, were still alive, including one pear tree, ancient and enormous, that had somehow kept bearing fruit through 60 years with nobody to tend it. The journal explained that too, eventually. Ruth Bell had spent years collecting seeds and cuttings from older regional varieties, trees and plants she believed handled drought and poor soil better than anything sold commercially. She hadn't just kept a garden. She'd been trying to preserve something she was watching disappear. The cabin's timber turned out to matter more than Mara initially understood. A contractor she'd hired to assess the structure's stability ran his hand along one of the hand-hewn beams, went quiet in a way contractors rarely go quiet, and asked where exactly she'd gotten this wood. It was already here, Mara said. Cabin's 100 years old, easy. This isn't oak or pine. He tapped the beam. This is chestnut. American chestnut, an old growth at that. He explained what Mara hadn't known, that a blight had wiped the species out commercially in the early 20th century, that what remained now was scattered, valuable, sought after by restoration specialists and furniture makers who paid serious money for timber that essentially couldn't be replaced. Elias Bell, whoever he'd been, had built his cabin out of wood that had become, entirely by historical accident, close to irreplaceable. Mara didn't fully register what that meant until word of the cabin's existence started moving through the county and reached a man named Calvin Rusk faster than she would have liked. Rusk ran a timber and land operation 2 counties over, and Mara learned, secondhand, that he'd been trying to acquire her 55 acres for years before the tax sale. The parcel connected 2 larger tracts he already controlled, and her land sitting independently in the middle of them had apparently been an irritation to his plans for longer than she'd owned it. He came out himself in early autumn, driving a truck considerably newer than anything else on the county road, and made his offer standing at her fence line without bothering to get out first. "I'll give you 4 times what you paid," he said. "Take the whole headache off your hands." "I paid $21, Mara said. "For times that isn't much of an offer. I mean 4 times its assessed value, and you know it." He looked past her toward the cabin, visible now from the road for the first time in decades. "That old wreck's not worth saving, Mrs. Whitaker. County'll cite you for the kudzu you haven't cleared yet before you ever get around to fixing a roof that old. Why do you want it, Mr. Rusk? 55 acres of hillside's not worth much to a timber operation unless there's timber on it, and you can see for yourself there isn't." He didn't answer that directly, which told her more than an answer would have. "I've got 2 tracks on either side of you," he finally said. "Your 55's the only thing keeping me from running equipment straight through instead of hauling everything the long way around the county road. It's not personal. It's just inconvenient, you sitting in the middle of it." Well, Mara held the fence rail, not unfriendly, just immovable. I suppose we're both inconvenienced then. He didn't push further that day, but he didn't look particularly worried either. The way a man doesn't worry when he's confident the numbers will eventually do his arguing for him. He wasn't wrong about the fines. 2 weeks later, a zoning notice arrived. Blight violations for the uncleared sections of the property, a deadline that would cost more to meet than Mara had left in savings, and a second, more generous offer from Rusk's office attached almost apologetically to the same certified envelope. She sat in the cabin that night with Elias's journal and the zoning notice both spread across the same overturned bucket she'd used as a chair since the first day she'd climbed down here, doing math that didn't come out any way she liked. She could pay the fines and keep clearing on her own timeline. Or she could take Rusk's offer, which would cover the fines twice over and leave her comfortable besides, and walk away from 55 acres she'd owned, at that point, for less than 4 months. She almost called his office that night. She got as far as finding the number on his letter, phone in hand, thumb hovering, running through the version of the conversation where she simply said yes and let someone else's checkbook solve a problem she hadn't asked for in the first place. Nobody would have blamed her. She'd bought the land for $21 on a whim, not a mission. She owed this place nothing, not really, not yet. She put the phone down without dialing. She thought about the family in the sepia photographs. About Elias's repeated worry over the lower place he'd never explained. About a woman named Ruth who'd spent years collecting seeds nobody had asked her to collect, patient in a way Mara wasn't sure she'd ever manage to be about anything in her own life. She didn't know yet whether any of it was worth what it was about to cost her to keep. She only knew that selling it now, before she understood what she was actually giving up, felt like a decision she'd regret in exactly the quiet, permanent way Elias's journal entries about Ruth's illness had made her regret things she'd never even experienced firsthand. The map answered part of it 3 days later. Studying it again by lantern light, Mara noticed a second marked spring on Elias's drawing, labeled, in his cramped handwriting, simply as lower, set apart from the channel she'd already found and cleared. She hadn't located it yet. The goats, as it turned out, already had. They'd been drifting toward the same uncleared corner of the property for over a week, the same restless habit that had first led her to the cabin. This time, when she followed them, they led her to a collapsed section of hillside choked in blackberry rather than kudzu, and beneath it, once she'd cleared enough to see stone, a second spring-fed basin, smaller than the first, but clearly, deliberately built. Set into the hillside just above the basin, nearly invisible beneath a final curtain of vine, was a low wooden door, warped but intact, set into what turned out to be a small root cellar dug back into the slope. The hinges had rusted solid, and Mara had to pry it open with a fence tool, bracing one boot against the frame. Inside, wooden crates lined the walls, most collapsed with age, their contents spilled across the dirt floor in a scatter of broken glass and rusted lids. But several jars, tucked toward the back where damp and time hadn't reached as thoroughly, had survived intact, sealed glass jars, each labeled in the same careful hand as the journal, filled with dried seeds, and, in a few, tightly wrapped grafting cuttings gone brittle with age. Bell heirloom tomato, saved 1961. Old line muscadine, cutting only. Sweet corn, drought strain, saved from grandmother Hollis's stock. Ruth Bell hadn't simply kept a garden. She'd spent years quietly preserving regional varieties she'd watched disappearing from farms around her, one labeled jar at a time, tucked into a hillside cellar nobody was ever supposed to need to find. Beside the cellar door, half buried, a flat marker stone carved with 2 initials, EB, and carved beneath the marker's initials, worn nearly smooth by 60 years of weather but still visible if you traced it with a fingertip, the same rose vine pattern from her grandmother's cedar chest. Mara sat back on her heels in the dirt and didn't move for a long time. She called her mother that evening, phone pressed to her ear while she sat on the cabin porch watching the goats work the last uncleared stretch of hillside in the fading light. Mom, did Grandma Evangeline ever talk about a farm? Before she married Grandpa. There was a pause long enough that Mara wondered if the call had dropped. Some, her mother finally said. Not much. She'd get quiet whenever it came up, and your grandfather always steered her off it pretty quick. I always figured there was something painful back there she didn't want dug up. Her maiden name was Belle. That's right. How'd you know that? Mara looked out at the cabin door, the rosevine carving just visible in the porch light. The same pattern she'd grown up running her thumb over on a cedar chest without ever once asking where it came from. Because I think I just bought her family's farm back, Mom. 55 acres. There's a cabin. There's a Bible with her name in it. Her mother didn't say anything for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone thick in a way Mara hadn't heard from her since her grandmother's funeral. She used to say the strangest thing when I was young. Said one day the land would remember us even if we forgot it first. I never understood what she meant by that. I don't think I even wrote it down anywhere. I just remembered it because it was such an odd thing for her to say. Mara looked out at the hillside a while after they hung up. 38 goats grazing ground that had waited 60 years for someone to come back and prove her grandmother right. She found it by accident more than design, prying at a stone in the chimney base that had seemed loose since she'd first cleared the hearth, curious more than hopeful. It came free easier than she expected, and behind it, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff with age, sat a Bible small enough to fit in two hands, its spine cracked, its pages soft as cloth. She carried it out to the porch to read in better light, careful with pages that threatened to tear at the fold. The genealogy page, when she found it, was written in at least 3 different hands across what looked like nearly a century. Names, marriages, births recorded in fading ink that got harder to read the further back the page went. She traced her finger down the list slowly, the way you read something you expect to be unfamiliar. Belle, married out to a Whitfield in one generation, a McCrae in the next. And then, near the bottom, in handwriting she recognized instantly, because she'd seen it her whole life on birthday cards and the inside covers of family photo albums. Evangeline Bell, B. 1938. Her grandmother's name. Her grandmother's actual maiden name, which Mara had always known distantly as a fact without ever once connecting it to anything real, because her grandmother had married a Whitaker decades before Mara was born, and the Bell name had simply stopped being spoken out loud somewhere along the way. Mara sat on the porch steps with the Bible open on her knees for a long time, not moving, doing the math of it over and over like she half expected it to come out differently if she checked enough times. It never did. It wasn't decorative. The carving was a family mark, cut onto anything the Bells considered worth protecting. The marker stone at the second spring, the cabin's door lintel once she finally cleared enough vine to expose it fully, and, 5 generations later, the lid of a cedar chest passed down through a family line that had, at some point, simply lost track of exactly where it started. Ruth and Elias Bell were Mara's great-great-grandparents. She hadn't stumbled onto an interesting old homestead. She had, by accident, at a county tax sale, bought back her own family's land. The unsent letter, when she finally read it properly, explained the rest. Ruth had written it to her daughter, years after leaving, and never found the nerve, or perhaps the address, to send it. "We didn't leave because the land failed us," it read, in handwriting gone shaky toward the end. "I got sick, and your father couldn't run 55 acres alone and nurse me besides, and there wasn't money enough for both. We left because sometimes you have to walk away from a place you love, not because you stopped loving it. If anyone ever finds this, I hope they understand the land wasn't abandoned because it was worthless. It was only ever waiting." Mara read that letter 3 times before she folded it carefully back into the tin box. She called the appraiser the next morning, not Rusk. A specialist named Dana Kessler drove out from 2 counties over within the week, spent the better part of a day running her hands along the cabin's beams the same way the contractor had, and confirmed what he'd already suspected: old-growth American chestnut, remarkably preserved, rare enough that a historical restoration society, working to rebuild period structures across 3 states, would pay well above standard timber rates for salvage this clean. "You understand what you're sitting on," Dana said, standing in the doorway Mara had spent months clearing a path to. "There's craftsmen and restoration outfits who'd give a great deal to get their hands on wood like this. You could sell the whole structure, salvage every board, and never touch this land again." "I know," Mara said. "I'm not doing that." Dana didn't push, the way people who genuinely understand value rarely do. "Then let's talk about what you can sell without losing the rest of it." They settled, over the following weeks, on a careful partial salvage, several beams from a collapsed outbuilding Mara had no intention of restoring anyway, timber that had already fallen rather than anything still holding the cabin together. A single block sent out for formal appraisal came back valued high enough on its own that the full sale, once finalized, covered the zoning fines twice over and left enough besides to secure the deed permanently, without selling a single acre or a single board of the cabin still standing to anyone. Rusk's final call was brief. Mara told him the land wasn't for sale, not now, not later, and didn't feel any particular need to explain why beyond that. He didn't push. Whatever he'd wanted the tract for, it apparently wasn't worth fighting a woman who'd just proven she could cover her own debts without him. The winter after the appraisal went into repair rather than clearing. A new roof over the section that had once been the false hillside, the chimney repointed by a mason who worked in exchange for 2 of the surviving muscadine cuttings from Ruth's seed cellar, window glass replaced pane by pane as Mara could afford it. She kept as much of the original structure as she safely could, patching rather than rebuilding wherever the old timber still held, because tearing out 100 years of Elias's work to make her own life easier felt like exactly the kind of shortcut that had let this land disappear under Kudzu in the first place. Word moved through the county the way it always did, slower at first, then all at once. An older farmer named Otis Pruitt, who'd laughed along with everyone else the week Mara bought the land, showed up at her gate that November, hat in hand in the literal sense, looking out at a hillside that had gone from impenetrable green to open, terraced, running water in under a year. "I'll admit I said some things at the feed store I probably shouldn't have," he started, turning his hat over once in his hands. "Called it a fool's dollar and worse." "I heard some version of it," Mara said, not unkindly. "You reckon you'd show me how you got that spring running again?" "Got one just like it, silted in, out past my back field. Always figured it was gone for good. Same as everybody figured this place was." "Sure," Mara said, and that was the whole exchange worth remarking on. No gloating, nothing to prove anymore. She spent an afternoon walking him through what Elias's journal had taught her, the same way the journal had once taught her, one patient explanation at a time. How to read the ground for hollow spots. How to follow a buried channel by the way certain plants grew greener above it even in a dry summer. How the land, if you paid close enough attention, would generally tell you where it had already been built to hold water, if only somebody was willing to listen. A year after the first machete swing through that wall of Kudzu, Mara stood on the repaired porch of the Bell cabin at dusk, coffee going lukewarm in her hand, watching 38 goats graze a hillside that had spent 60 years pretending to be nothing at all. Water moved steadily through the old stone channel below. The ancient pear tree, pruned back properly for the first time in decades, had put out more fruit that season than anyone expected. Inside, on the wall beside the door, hung the sepia photograph of Elias and Ruth Bell that had waited in a tin box under a floorboard for 60 years to be found. And on the mantel beside it, finally reunited with the carved door lintel it had been separated from for 5 generations, sat her grandmother's cedar chest, same rosevine pattern, same family mark, home at last on land that had never really been abandoned. It had just been waiting on somebody to come back and remember it. If a story like this, where the land you almost walked past turns out to be the one thing that was always meant to find its way back to you, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever inherited something you didn't understand the meaning of until much later, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.